In this video, I'm going to show you how to create these amazing Japanese sweets called Wagashi. They're made up of a type of sweetened bean paste and come in an unlimited number of shapes and sizes. It's really edible art with artists dedicating their lives to creating these pieces. It was fun creating these confections because it allows you a lot of creativity when modeling. They have this really interesting texture and make use of cool geometric shapes, and the results give you this really satisfying feeling too. I won't go into super detail on how to make every kind of wagashi as there are countless designs, but instead, I'll show you the general process and key tips to get you started and for some inspiration. Getting inspiration for your wagashi shapes won't be too difficult as there are many high quality images available for reference. I'll also be providing a link to a sample blend file that has the wagashi material shader set up if you want to follow along or create your own confections. Let's start with the material. At first, you might think the material is simple, but it actually contains some fine details that are really important to get a good render. Without it, you'll find your renders look like they're made of hard clay instead of being soft and moldable. It took a bunch of trial and error, and it's fully made in Blender's shader engine. First, I used this free add-on to easily create procedural dot noises. The download link is in the description box below. The wagashi material has 5 main parts. The base material. At first look, wagashi's surface looks smooth and uniform, but they are not as the mixing of the bean paste, granulated sugar, and food coloring isn't perfect. It's very subtle, but we have to add these undissolved bits in our texture. We do this by first covering the entire object with small circles, and then linking it to a color ramp node for the base color. For the base bump, we start with the noise texture and blend it with our bumps. This is also blended in with our bump map of our powdered sugar, which I'll get to in a second. All this is fed into a bump node where I adjust the strength depending on how bumpy I want the surface. This depends on the lighting and the actual confection I'm modeling. Wagashi isn't glossy, and it's basically the dot pattern that's been adjusted to be more white or more rough. Sugar dusting. Many wagashi have white spots sprinkled throughout. This isn't necessarily powdered sugar, but could also be larger chunks of bean paste. From a distance though, it does look like powdered sugar. This is another dot pattern, but slightly larger, whose edge is broken up by a noise texture. We use a couple color ramp nodes to control how much the edges are broken up and the overall strength of the dots. This is then mixed in with a uniform color, which is a lighter version of our base color, to get dots sprinkled over our surface. Ambient occlusion. Because the base material has subsurface scattering and translucency, we lose some sense of depth that should be caused by the wrinkles and folds on our mesh. To compensate for this, I use an ambient occlusion node to create the fake shadows and blend this in with our base color. This adds back some of the sense of depth by adding a bit of fake shadows in our color map. See the difference? It's very subtle. Subsurface scattering and translucency. Now, in our BSDF node, we want to add a bit of subsurface scattering. This is important and you'll find yourself tweaking these values depending on the lighting. In addition, we don't get all the translucent effects from the subsurface scattering, so I need to add some transmission to the BSDF shader and sometimes mix in a translucent shader to get the desired results. These get frequently adjusted based on the scene and lighting. Undissolved crystals. At first glance, the surface might look smooth, but it actually looks like this. The surface has tiny granules of undissolved sugar crystals and other particles. These are really small, but not small enough to be simulated using the material's roughness value, yet smaller than something you can simulate on a normal map. If you try to do this on a normal map, you simply get this weird bumpy surface that doesn't look right even on really high scale values. Instead, I have this trick I've used before where I cover the entire mesh with really small crystal-like objects. This simulates the tiny granules at the surface. I do this using geometry nodes. I simply scatter objects across the surface of the mesh. I use this transform node here so I can adjust how far out the crystals protrude from the mesh and adjust as needed. You have to make the objects really small and you only need a few. It adds this subtle light scattering on the surface and it really sells that the material is made up of this bean paste mixed with granulars of sugar rather than a solid uniform ball. Don't make the crystals too long, otherwise it will destroy the subtleness and make your object look hairy. Pro tip, if you find you're not getting nice scattering results with geometry nodes or having performance issues because of the little crystals, I sometimes swap it out with the particle system and use hairs. Try that out. Be careful with the denoiser. While almost every Blender tutorial out there says to use the denoiser, with many food renders, including this one, you want to be careful using it. We did a lot of work to add subtle surface details, and if you use a denoiser afterwards, if you get strange results, you may find much of the detail was smoothed away, especially at lower resolutions. So, just something to watch out for. With that, start having fun. Just fool around with all shapes and sizes. For smaller detail items like leaves, I often find or create 2D templates and trace out the object shape. For symmetrical objects, I generally reduce the workload by using the mirror modifier and only tracing half the object. After the shape is completed, I use the solidify modifier to create thickness and the subdivision modifier to round out the edges. Remember, the smaller the shape, the less translucency and subsurface scattering you'll need. There are no rules, but I find the more complex and colorful wagashi make more interesting renders. Many wagashi are made up of a single base object. I found it easier and more precise to try to create these shapes as much as possible by moving vertices, edges, or even faces with proportional editing instead of sculpting. This creates rounded edges that look like they've been pressed by fingers. Because wagashi is moldable, it's important to make it look like it's sitting snugly on the surface and not floating in the air. The key to realistic wagashi is the imperfections. You can't have perfect geometric shapes. Real hands modeled these pieces of art, and you need to replicate these small imperfections in your model. While you can do some of it with displacement maps, you still get a better result by adding in some manual manipulations using the sculpt tool, specifically the grab tool, to make these small manipulations to the mesh. You need to have sufficient geometry to create these minute displacements mentioned beforehand, so they're not low poly. However, if your scene doesn't require close-ups, you can omit some of these smaller details. Wagashi is as much art as it is food. Most wagashi photos are taken with soft lighting and small apertures. In addition, most real wagashi photos incorporate Japanese lacquer or slate plates with plant leaves and bamboo mats in the background. One final trick. Sometimes when you add subsurface scattering to small objects, you won't want the subsurface values to be uniform across the entire object, otherwise it'll produce a green or blue tinge in the thin areas. I found the only way to get around this is to painfully mask out the areas I want the subsurface scattering to be reduced. And that's it. This was a great exercise in creating new and unusual shapes that were not over the top complicated. Fine detail was the key to making these look photorealistic, and I think the results look pretty good. Hope this gives you ideas on your own projects. Thanks for watching.